Alex, and we will just do a quick introduction. They won't introduce you. We'll probably introduce you by letting you introduce yourself and like just stating your credentials and so forth. We'll get on into the topic. I mean, it doesn't have to be extremely formal. It could just be a generic conversation.
Mm-hmm. However you like, yeah.
And all right, cool. So, are we live right now?
Yeah.
Okay, let me just start recording.
Yeah, already recording.
All right, cool. All right, so thank you for tuning in to the third episode of Arguments from Reason. Dylan, how are you feeling today?
I'm feeling good.
Awesome. We're both pretty excited because we have a pretty awesome friend and someone that we look up to in the realm of philosophy as a guest with us today. His name is Alex Malpass. If you are Matt Slick or a fan of the transcendental argument, you have probably stumbled upon him in his dialogue with Matt Slick with regards to the transcendental argument. And today we are honored to be joined by him. And I'll just kind of let Alex introduce himself and uh, give greetings all the way from, I think, England, if I'm
Yeah, that's right.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And so forth. So Alex, feel free to just introduce yourself.
Okay, so so I guess I'm a philosopher. I mean, I have a PhD in philosophy, and I was a lecturer for a little while. These days, I'm doing this as a hobby, I suppose, more kind of interest. So I have a blog on which I write about things to do with philosophy of religion. I'm also doing a podcast where I talk to professional philosophers about various things, not all to do with philosophy of religion. That's called Thoughtology. So yeah, I don't know. And yeah, I talked to Matt Slick a couple of times. I don't want that to be my lasting legacy, though, if possible.
That's true, yes. And he has a pretty awesome blog. I always find myself reading it. He's had some pretty interesting, mind-boggling articles in there, and his podcast is pretty awesome as well. I think your podcast is up on iTunes now, correct?
Yeah, the one episode is. I haven't quite got my head around how it works, but yeah, I managed to get one episode up. So yeah, hopefully the next one
Awesome.
will come up soon as well.
Yeah, so last episode we spoke about the classical methodology, and we focused on a few of their arguments. I think they were the ontological, cosmological, teleological, moral argument, and argument from resurrection. And I think we spoke a bit on C.S. Lewis' trilemma. And Alex wanted to come on the show and just have a dialogue on these arguments and kind of speak about them from his perspective and what he thinks are their strength, if any, and their weaknesses.
Yeah, so I don't know how you want to go through things, or it's up to you really. Happy to be led in whatever direction you want to go in.
Yeah, just kind of feel free to just let's just start with the cosmological, and we could just kind of just have a free conversation from there. You could just talk about it. We could you could choose whether to talk about the kalam or whichever specific formulation of it. Just feel free to just lead the conversation from here.
So obviously there are different versions of all of these arguments, and different ones will have been formulated in such a way as to avoid particular objections. And not much I'm going to say will be original to me. So I'm sure that these things can all be found elsewhere. And nothing I'm going to say will be decisive, of course, right? There's very few instances where anybody can actually completely kill a philosophical argument. So these things are not black and white settled matters pretty much ever, right? And I mean, I guess from the outset, there's something like we should just take a step back and think about what happens with arguments and what are we doing? Why are we giving these types of arguments? What do we expect to happen, right? And it seems to me that, just as a kind of empirical observation, I think that it's probably true that they very rarely actually change anybody's mind, right? I'd be surprised if anyone became, in any sense, kind of confidently believing Christian on the basis of the ontological argument or something, right? But probably doesn't happen very often. So as a tool for apologetics, I don't really see them as being particularly good. I mean, if you want to win people over to your way of living, way of seeing the world, whatever, I think it'd be much better to just, behave in a certain way, right? And show people how good it is to be that way. That's right. The right way to win people over. Like being nice, being charitable, being forgiving, blah, blah, blah. That seems to me the best way to win people to Christianity. Giving them the modal ontological argument, basically not going to work. It seems to me anyway. Right? So just from the outset, I don't really see these as being particularly useful in the actual task of apologetics. Well, I do see them as being useful. I mean, I see them being fun from an intellectual point of view to go through and assess the relative strengths and weaknesses, like a lawyer going through the possible defenses that their client might have or something. Right? So there's some kind of sporty kind of exercise that goes on here, which is interesting to do. And I think they're also useful in the sense of like they, as a kind of therapeutic tool to some extent, right? So they setting out in a very clear way the interrelations between the different things that you believe, right? So you can see sometimes with a good argument that it's testing two things, one of which you think is true and one of which you think is false, and it's kind of trying to show you that there's a tension between them, right? That the true thing entails the false thing or something, right? So you've got to give up one of them, or you've got to show that the entailment doesn't hold, right? And doing that is a kind of internal, like house cleaning or something. It's making you aware of internal tensions and inconsistencies in your own views, which, if you want to have a consistent way of looking at things, you need to iron them out, you need to resolve them. So an argument like the ontological arguments, I don't know why I'm picking on the ontological argument, but let's just keep doing that. So an argument like that might be good for highlighting inconsistencies in the way that you're thinking, and coming to terms with it and resolving it to your own satisfaction might be a way of straightening that out in your own head of how you think about things. So I think there's benefits to them, but I think winning people over to Christ or something probably isn't really one of them. I don't know. Do you agree with my assessment there?
I rarely go on, Dylan.
In general, I don't think most people will ever be convinced of a particular argument. They may feel pushed back if they're not familiar with it, but in general, they won't be convinced of it. But I agree that they can help us think clear, because we have to think through different ideas and see if we're being inconsistent anywhere, and through that we can start thinking clearer. But we're not generally going to persuade people that God exists or God doesn't exist by virtue of these arguments.
Right. Okay, good. And I mean, there's so there's two ways of looking at apologetics as well, right? Which is like, on the one hand, you've got apologetics, which is a method of persuading people, and apologetics on the other. So maybe call that offensive, as in on the offense, not as in causing offense, right? But offensive apologetics as opposed to defensive apologetics, which is where somebody asks you, why do you think this? And you're able to give some kind of cogent explanation for it. And I think that these types of arguments might be better suited to playing that second role, where, if somebody says, well, why do you think that God exists or something? And then you can say something like, well, I think that, it's the best explanation for why anything exists or something. And then you can spell that out in more detail with the cosmological argument or something. That might be a way of you just explaining why you think that. But it seems like we've kind of agreed that it's not necessarily going to be particularly persuasive. Certainly not going to be persuasive if somebody is like not on the fence, right? If somebody wants to have their mind changed, then maybe they only need one more straw on the camel's back to be pushed over to that side, and maybe the ontological argument could do that. But I mean, it seems like if that's the only thing, right, then it seems very unlikely that would do it. Anyway,
right.
So having just undermined the whole point of these arguments, let's look at them. And so which one did you want me to?
Let's start with the kalam cosmological argument.
Okay, yeah, the kalam cosmological argument. Okay, so this is Craig puts it as just a three-premise or two-premise and a conclusion argument, right? So everything which begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe had a cause. And strictly speaking, that's the kalam cosmological argument. So on its own, it's not actually an argument for God. It's an argument for the being a first cause to the universe, right? And it's only when it's appended with another bunch of steps where once you've established that there must be a cause, say that you do, then you go on to say more things about it, like where it has to be, not material and blah, blah, blah. And that's supposed to get you to this, like, it has to be a spiritual kind of being or something, which is the first cause. So it's a terminological issue, but if the kalam cosmological argument stops at that premise that therefore the universe had a cause, it's not actually an argument for God's existence, right? But whatever. But it is what it is. I mean, I still think that it's. I still don't find it in any sense a persuasive, plausible-looking argument. So there are various avenues that you can attack this with. I mean, it's got a kind of scientific set of supports and a sort of philosophical set of supports, and each of those can be challenged in their own ways. I'm not a scientist or physicist in any sense, so I'll leave the undermining of the science to people who are better at explaining it than I am. So let's see, the first premise is everything which begins to exist has a cause for its existence, or something along those lines. So, I mean, there are things from physics, say, like particles, which can just pop into existence apparently for no cause, right? They just appear, particle-antiparticle pair, and then they annihilate with one another, and it leaves the overall energy level of the universe the same, or something like that, right? So, as I said, I'm not going to talk about that any further, but just to say, it does seem like there could in fact just be empirical instances of things that do just begin to exist without having any prior cause. It might just straightforwardly be false, if that's the case, right? But my main kind of line of objection to this is, well, it's where Craig goes in his own explanation of why he thinks that premise is true. Right? So he tends to say things along the lines of, right, so it must, so everything that begins to exist must have something causing it to come into existence, right? And the idea is that, well, it couldn't come into existence from nothing, right? Because nothing can't cause anything to come into existence, right? Nothing doesn't have any powers of causation whatsoever. Right? It's just nothing. It's empty of all properties at all.
Right.
Now it seems to me that idea plays on a sort of subtle fallacy and it's equivocation over two senses of the word nothing, right? So on the one hand, we might think of the word nothing being like a name or something, right? A term which refers to an entity, and the particular type of entity that it refers to is a kind of void that doesn't have any contents whatsoever. It's just, blackness or something, an emptiness, a void of, devoid of any properties at all, right? So on that view, the word nothing picks out semantically what it does in the sentence. So for instance, if I say, this cup has got coffee in it, right? The words this cup act in the sentence by pointing to the cup, right? And then, so that the role of the phrase this cup is as a kind of arrow, is metaphorically speaking, which points at the thing that it refers to, its referent. And if you think of nothing in this way, it has a similar role, you might think, right? Points to this empty void idea of nothingness. And so in that case, when you say that nothing can't cause anything to come into existence, right? Nothing has no causal powers. The word nothing there, if it's thought of as having the same sort of semantic role as the cup, as the words this cup, right? Then it points towards this nothingness. And it says of that nothingness that has no causal powers. Now, on the other hand, there's a different way of seeing the phrase nothing there, which is slightly more complicated, but it's to say something like, there is no thing right? Rather than saying nothing, it's not something which refers to an empty object. It's just simply saying that none of the actual objects are the thing in question, right? So if I say nothing is going to get me to work on time, sorry, nothing is going to stop me getting to work on time, right? I'm saying there is no thing which is going to stop me getting to work on time. I'm not saying emptiness, a void of nothingness, is going to stop me getting to work on time. If I tell you nothing's going to stop me getting to work on time, I'm expressing my determination that I'm going to get to work on time, right? That's what that phrase means. It doesn't mean I will in fact be stopped from getting to work by a big empty void of nothingness, right? So it seems clear from sentences like nothing's going to stop me getting to work on time that there is at least another sense to the word nothing, which doesn't function simply as a pointer to an object, right? To, in this case, an empty object, but it's saying none of the actual things that exist are such that blah, 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 they'll stop me getting to work on time or something.
So in Craig's view, is he assuming the first definition or is he using the second definition?
Well, so let's look at the sentence. So if you say something, if the sentence in question is something like nothing has no causal powers, it must be that he's using, it seems to me anyway, it must be that he's using the first usage of the word, right?
Right.
Because the second usage of the word would be there is no thing such that it has no causal powers. It's a different sentence. Sorry, which is false, did you say?
Yeah, that would be false to say no thing has causal powers.
No thing has no causal powers, right? Nothing has no causal powers.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't know whether even, so there are, I don't know, numbers, are they things that exist? If they are, it seems like they don't have causal powers. And so the sentence, no thing has no causal powers, it seems like it's ruling things out like numbers. It's basically saying that the only things that exist have causal powers. I mean, regardless of whether that sentence is true or not, it doesn't seem to be what Craig has in mind. He means the big void emptiness without any contents to it. That thing couldn't produce a thing which, like a universe or a person or something, right? That void it has no properties whatsoever. Well, and so why am I making this distinction? It seems to me that there's two things you can say about that. The first one is that it's a rather strange, I mean, when you start to think about nothing being used in the first sense, it's rather strange, right? So the way that type of phrase works, like when I was talking about this cup has coffee in it, the contribution it makes to a sentence that it features in is by pointing to the thing, like the coffee cup. And if the coffee cup, the actual thing that exists, has coffee in it, then the whole sentence is true, right? So this coffee cup has coffee in it.
Right.
It needs to, the first bit of the sentence, this coffee cup, points to the referent. And then if the coffee cup fulfills the condition, which is has coffee in it, then the sentence is true, right? Those seems to be the truth conditions for the sentence. But when we're talking about the word nothingness or the word nothing being a semantic vehicle in the same way, well, it points to a thing which is kind of doesn't exist, right? By definition, nothingness isn't anything which exists, right? There's
Right.
nothing there at all. So it succeeds in playing its semantic role if and only if the thing that it's supposed to refer to isn't a thing, right? So there's a kind of puzzlement here about how there could really be a referent, how there could be a semantic term that plays that type of role if the thing that it's supposed to refer to isn't a thing, right? This is a kind of paradox called it's dealt with a lot in analytic philosophy, but it's kind of a negative existential, sometimes called Plato's beard. This problem, right? But I mean, there's things that you can do to get around that, but it's becomes very, very complicated. I mean, but secondly, well, no, to stick on that, let's develop that a little bit more. It might be that you'd think that saying about something like nothingness that it doesn't exist, right, is to make some kind of logical, metaphysical error, right? As if you could talk about something which doesn't exist. Because you might say, look, all the things that there are exist, right? you can't refer to something that doesn't exist. Right? If you refer to something that doesn't exist, you're just not referring to anything. It might be one way of looking at it, right? And in which case, for instance, if I say something like, Sherlock Holmes is a detective or something, right? I'm not really referring to anything, right? There isn't anything which is Sherlock Holmes, and that's because Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist. Right? What's happening when I say Sherlock Holmes is a detective is something much more like complicated. I'm saying something about a fiction that was written down by a particular person, and in that fiction, right, there's this character that's described or something like that, right? And ultimately, my reference grounds out in some agreed socio-cultural behavior or some words on a page or something, but like ultimately it grounds out in something that exists. It doesn't make any sense to say there's this thing called Sherlock Holmes and that's who I'm talking about, but he doesn't exist, right? Because then we've committed this fallacy, which is to say there's this thing, but he doesn't exist, right? So if you think that that's plausible, then talking about nothingness as this thing, which is the referent of the term, but nothing, but which doesn't exist, is to commit the same fallacy, right? It's kind of reifying nothing into a thing, right? So it's kind of committing the fallacy of reification, we might say.
Right. So if Craig does this and he says, out of nothing, nothing comes, or something like that,
yeah,
then he's treating nothingness as an actual thing, which wouldn't be right. And so if he can't actually do that, if he's committing a fallacy in doing that, then he can never actually make the claim out of nothing, nothing comes, because nothingness isn't a thing to talk about.
Yeah, that's
right.
Yeah, that's right. And the last thing I want to say about this really is just that I would be slightly more sympathetic to it if I could think of a use of the word nothing, which outside the apologetical philosophical like setting, which had the first sense and not the second, right? So if I say something like, there's nothing I like more than ice cream, I don't mean there is a big empty void which I like more than ice cream, right? That's obviously not what I mean. What I mean is there is no thing, out of all of the things that there are, none of them are things that I like more than ice cream, right? So that's obviously the second sense of nothing and not the first, right? It's not a referent. It's I'm saying of all of the things that there are that it doesn't fulfill. None of those things fulfill the condition of being things that I like more than ice cream, right? So it's the second use. And I think almost every use of the word nothing that I've kind of bumped into casually in conversation with people who aren't talking about philosophy, whenever I've thought about it, have turned into being obviously cases of the second use of the phrase nothing and not the first. It just leads me to be suspicious about it. Like I just feel like it's a concept that's being entirely made up by philosophers, and it seems to, there's no real, if this concept doesn't have any scientific grounding, and it's not even something that we talk about in everyday life, if we're just making it up for the purposes of doing philosophy, I'm kind of suspicious about that. I mean, it just seems to me that I can't place any real weight on it. Right? I certainly wouldn't place the conclusion of an argument that's supposed to make me change my life and accept there being a God or something, when there's this concept in there which, like, I'm extremely suspicious of it really being legitimate at all. It seems to me I could say everything I need to without ever talking about this big empty void of nothingness. So I mean, I could talk about the kalam for quite a long time, actually, but I suppose I've gone into too much detail about that already.
Ultimately, this is more so like an undercutting objection to his support for the first premise. So
yeah, I mean, okay. So you were also quite right to point out that the kalam presupposes Craig's favoured A theory of time, which is controversial in the sense that it's not impossible, but very difficult to square easily with contemporary physics, right? That on the A theory of time, the basic temporal relations are tenses, basically. There is, was, and will be. And yet, according to the special relativity, there isn't really any complete, the universe isn't split up into three brackets of is, was, and will be, past, present, and future. the structure is much more complicated than that. I don't know if you've ever done any like ever looked at relativistic physics in any sense, but you
only a little, not too much.
So you can talk about there being, so given any particular point, like the exact point of here and now, say pick some infinitesimal point in space-time, right? There's, you can talk about the causal future and the causal past of this point event, which is, so causal future would be anywhere which is reachable by the speed of light from this point, right? So if I travel in any direction with the speed of light, so if it takes me, I don't know, 7 minutes to get to the sun or something, right? Then the sun is in the causal future of this point event only in 7 minutes time, right? So the sun right now is outside the causal future of this point event. It's in the kind of, I'm not describing this very well, but if you think about a graph, right, with your x and y axis. So we just imagine there's one space axis and one time axis going up and down, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Then you have a kind of a cone that goes towards the future, where the diagonal lines are the speed of light, and a cone that closes in on the here and now point, which is everything that could have arrived here by the speed of light. And everything that's on either side of that, the kind of wings that are on either side, are kind of causally indeterminate from as of this point event, right? And what it means is that those areas that are on either side of this point event, whether something is simultaneous with, or slightly in the future or slightly in the past of this event, is there's no absolute answer to that, right? So let's say there's an eruption that's going on, so right now on the surface of the sun. Really, what special relativity tells you is that whether or not that eruption on the sun is exactly simultaneous with this point event depends merely on the choice of a bunch of frames of reference, which don't really exist in any sense. They're just like conventional choices, unless it's in this future light cone or past light cone of the event. There's no absolute matter of fact about that, right? There's just lots of different ways of describing those same events. What that means is that simultaneity, the idea of two things happening at the same time, kind of breaks down, or at least it's restricted, drastically restricted by these light cone things. But what that means is that if you want to be an A-theorist and say that there's some absolute matter of fact about what the present is, right? What isness, presentness, as opposed to past and futureness, then it, unless you're willing to accept a whole lot of auxiliary hypotheses to keep that and keep the physics, you've got a straightforward clash. So Craig's kalam cosmological argument relies on this troublesome A theory of time, and maybe you can recast the argument in terms of the B theory, which doesn't take tenses to be basic aspects of reality, but it's not clear that can happen. At least it's not a lot more theoretically difficult to do that. You need a lot more, as I said, uncomfortable auxiliary hypotheses.
So it seems to me that when Craig presents this argument to university students or wherever, a lot of them will not be familiar with the A theory and B theory distinction. And most people just assume, well, yeah, okay, A theory sounds intuitively correct because that's how we experience life. So they'll just pick up on it. But it seems to me if he's not talking about that, he's obscuring a lot of the complexities of his actual argument. Would you agree with that?
I think I've seen him address the point when it's been brought up. So, and I think he has argued for the A theory in print. I mean, he has a book about.
Yeah, he has a book on time.
Yeah, right. His first book, I think. So I don't think he's hiding this fact, right? But it's not like, so what you want out of an argument is that it's, or at least what Craig wants to have with these types of arguments, is that the premises are uncontroversial and the conclusion gets you towards believing in God or something. But the premises are not as uncontroversial as simply saying, well, everything which begins to exist has a cause or something. Once you look at it in more detail, you have to accept a rather controversial theory of, well, yeah, he wants to push this unpopular theory, the A theory. It's not popular with philosophers anyway. I mean, it's intuitive with kind of average person on the street. I mean, the A theory and the B theory terminology comes from this paper in, I think, 1908 by John McTaggart, which is a good paper, although it's got this incomprehensible paradox in there. But his idea is that, like, there's basically two ways of thinking about time, right? One, which is that, like, we say things are past, present, and future, right? You know, the beginning of this conversation is past, right? We've started this middle bit of the conversation is present, and presumably at some point in the future it will finish. Right? So we think about this, and it feels like we're kind of being carried down a stream or something, and that as we watch the scenery moving past us, we feel this idea of motion or something. Things which were future become present and then become past. Right? But on the other hand, we also think of, and that's the A theory basically. But on the other hand, we also think of things equally intuitively, it seems to me. We also think of things in terms of earlier than and later than, right? So I'll say, and you know, the very same events, right? But if I say something like World War I was earlier than World War II, right, and World War II was later than World War I, those facts, earlier than and later than facts, don't depend on, you know, they don't change, right? Okay, of course, but World War I was future, then it was present, and then now it's past, right? But it's being earlier than World War II doesn't change. That's just a fact, right? It doesn't depend on where I am in relation to World War I or II, right? One's earlier than the other's later than the first one, and that fact is just static and fixed. So there's this kind of dynamic element of time where it seems like it moves, and then there's this fixed spatial element of time where it seems like it's just a dimension that has things, you know, one after another, and both of those are there in our conception of time. And then the 20th century philosophy of time has been going through kind of seeing what to make out of this distinction. Like, is one better than the other? Can they be resolved? Should we drop one? Whatever. Considerations from physics kind of made philosophers, well, not just the considerations from physics, but definitely considerations from physics helped pushing philosophers into thinking that the B theory must be the right one, something along the lines of the B theory anyway, right? It's kind of well conceded that the A theory is much more difficult to square with things like relativity. So yeah, that's where we've got to. I mean, yes, I guess for people, if they don't know that background, might be led into thinking that the kalam is a lot more straightforward than it really is.
Yeah, that was my point. Because I know he brings it up at points, but generally if he's in a debate or something, it usually doesn't come up. And the average person listening to it might not be aware of it. So it can easily be obscured in that regard. It's more like rhetoric than bringing out all the issues.
Yeah. And so, okay, one last thing on the kalam. So let's just apply my distinction quick. I'm trying to be quick. So I might say something like, look, maybe the universe is all that there is, right? Maybe it just began to exist and it doesn't have a cause for it. I mean, as a first response, an apologist might say, well, everything, look around you, like all the things that you know that begin to exist, you know, your iPhone, your cup, your house, whatever, they all had causes for their existence, right? And you're just going against that universal testimony of your experience to say that maybe the universe just exists without having a cause, right? But you know, the quick counter to that is that it's not a proper comparison. I mean, everything that I see around me which began to exist had a cause which also exists within the universe, right? I've never seen anything be caused to exist by something outside the universe, and yet that's supposed to be the proposition. So I have no testimony that shows me something like that happening. It's not clear that it's how to square the experience that we have of things coming into existence and their causal origins with the question of everything that there is, right? The universe in general coming into existence and whether or not that had a cause. It's unclear whether we can use our intuitions for it whatsoever. But If I say maybe the universe comes into being, or if I say something like, the universe is just all that there is, I don't feel like it's fair to represent me as saying, oh, you think it just popped into existence from nothing. I don't mean from nothing. Right? I'm saying that there isn't anything other than the universe. That's all that there is. It's uncharitable to construe that as there being a void, an empty void of nothingness, and then sort of magically this thing popped out of that thing, because it makes it, again, we're reifying nothing into a thing, sort of weird, dubiously, a thing of dubious status, which exists before the universe, and that thing gives birth to the universe. Right? That does sound like a perplexing suggestion, but I'm not quite clear what's so perplexing about the idea that the universe is just all that there is. And when phrased like that, I don't see anything that Craig has to offer seeming remotely plausible. I mean, I don't know that that's true. I don't know that the universe is all that there is. I'm just saying that seems to be at least on the table. And if someone wants to take that off the table, they just should give me some kind of consideration that undermines it, and I don't know any. So,
well, I think Craig's idea there would be to say, why does the universe exist then? If the universe exists, or all that exists, why does it exist? And that would be the line of his argument for the principle of sufficient reason cosmological argument.
Okay, so maybe we should go on to the contingency.
Sure,
yeah. Well, okay, so then, does one of you want to lay that argument out, or?
Yeah, sure. So Craig's idea is that whether or not the universe came into existence or not, it could be eternal for all the argument matters. There is a question of why the universe exists, and he bases it off the principle of sufficient reason, which is basically the idea that for anything that it exists either necessarily or by some other cause, for some reason of its existence. And he said, since the universe isn't a necessary thing, his idea is you can imagine the universe not existing, then it's contingent and therefore must have an explanation for its existence. And his explanation is God.
Okay, good. So, right. So with this argument, let's be clear a little bit that let's say that God is a necessarily existing thing, right? So I could say something like, well, why does my cup exist? Well, my cup exists as a contingent thing which could have not existed. It doesn't have to exist. It's not necessarily existing. And its existence is dependent on some other thing's existence before it, the thing that made the cup, the group of things which collectively put the cup together. And their existence, in turn, depends on other things' existences. And this chain of dependency goes back, right? Now, either goes back forever, or it terminates at some arbitrary point, or it terminates at a point which is a necessarily existing thing. And those seem to be the three options, right? So, and the problem is supposed to be, if it goes on forever, that there's no overall explanation for why anything exists. And if it terminates at an arbitrary stopping point, then there's no explanation for why that stopping point, rather than some other stopping point. Right? That's just not an explanation, it seems, right? And so the only option that seems to be left on the table is that it terminates in something whose existence is itself necessary. Now, first of all, I don't really agree that an infinite chain of contingent dependency doesn't. Every single thing in there has its own explanation. Right? My cup's existence is explained by those things which brought it into being. And the fact that those things have, those things have their explanation as well, right? That everything is explained. It's just not the case that the whole thing is explained. Now, I'm not quite clear why. Does it matter that the whole thing doesn't have an explanation? Maybe, but if we're agreed that every single thing that exists has its own sort of local explanation, maybe that's all that there is. Right? And so it's kind of unclear already what's wrong with that first option. I guess I'll just skip over the second. Let's just agree that an arbitrary contingent stopping point is unacceptable. But let's look at the third option, right, which is that the chain of dependencies, its explanatory chain, terminates in a thing whose existence is necessary, and that's supposed to be God. Well, it seems to me that that this option is actually no better than the second option, which is just an arbitrary stopping point. And the reason for that is something like this, right? So it's no good to just say that everything depends on its for its existence on a necessarily existing thing. And that necessarily existing thing has to have some kind of relationship to the existence of all of these dependent things, right? Like the number 1 might be construed as a necessarily existing thing, but no one thinks that that is in any sense responsible for the contingent universe that exists. When we're talking about God being the explanation, that's presumably because God's supposed to have created everything. He's the creator of the universe, unlike the number 1, which isn't the creator of the universe. So what's supposed to be going on here is that God is performing an act of creation, right? Like at the beginning of the Bible or wherever, right? Where God decrees the universe to come into existence. Now the question is, that act on behalf of God there is itself something which is either contingent or necessary, right? And either way you go, you run into trouble. So let's see. Let's say that God's decision to create the universe was necessary. Now you might think that it's necessary on the basis that some property that God has, and presumably all of God's properties are necessarily had by him. He doesn't have contingent properties. So let's say that one of his properties is that he wants to be in a loving relationship with human beings or something. Well, if that's true, that God wants to be in that relationship and that's why he created the universe, then because that property was had by him necessarily, and it was enough to make him spur into action and create the universe, that means that the existence of the universe isn't contingent at all. It's actually necessary. It has to happen because God has this property and he has to have that property, and that property causes him to bring the universe into existence. So actually the universe isn't contingent. The contingency of the universe is like the first premise of this argument. So we get a contradiction if we go down that route, right? In fact, the universe isn't contingent at all. If the universe is not contingent, you can just say, well, maybe the universe is necessary and it doesn't need to have an explanation for it. Right, so it seems to me if we go down that route, we're stuck in a big dialectical problem. But the only other option seems to be that the explanation for, well, that God's decision to create the universe wasn't necessitated by any property of his, right? That it was just, he just did it, right? But then if that's what happened, and if you want to say, why did God make this universe instead of one that's exactly like this one, but where I have like one less hair than I do? Like, why did he choose this one over that one? If ultimately there's no answer to that question, then it's just random. Right? There's no reason why this happened and not that. Right? Even though God did it, there's no reason why God did it. And if that's where it terminates, then that's exactly the same as the second option, which was just a load of contingent stuff, goes back to a certain point, and then there's no explanation any further. Right? We just go back to, yeah, okay, God's existence might be necessary, but his reason for doing this rather than that is contingent, and that's what's actually doing the explanation here. So it seems to me that either if you go down this God created the universe route, you're stuck with it being either necessary, which contradicts the beginning of the argument and undermines the need for going down this route at all, or we say that it's contingent, in which case the explanation is exactly comparable to the second option, right? So that's my
this is pushing the problem just a step back further to God, and then seeing how the proposition that God created the universe doesn't really solve the problem at all. It just creates more problems or doesn't solve it. Just
I suppose. Second option. So to say it as simply as possible, it's there aren't really three options. There's actually only two. The universe either exists necessarily and doesn't need an explanation, or it exists contingently without an explanation. And saying that God is a third option actually boils down to it having to be one of those two options anyway in the end. And either God did it by necessity, in which case it doesn't need an explanation anyway, or God did it by pure, contingent chance and that didn't have an explanation, and therefore the universe doesn't have an explanation. Right? So on neither outcome, this isn't a third option, essentially. It just looks like a third option until you actually go through.
Like, I know theologians will play the mystery card, so they'll say, well, God created the universe, but we don't know why he created the universe.
Yeah,
which
right.
You could take that position, but it doesn't help the argument in any way.
No, it's because this is an argument that turns on the idea of explanation. So it's one of the obvious times where you can't play the mystery card, right? I mean, you can play the mystery card if you just want to say, well, look, I don't know why the universe is created. But if the argument is the universe must have an explanation and that explanation must be God, you can't then say, but it's a mystery why or how he does it, right? Then you're just saying that's not an explanation anymore, basically.
Right. So
That's
you'd
as
have
if
to pick
a
one or the other.
philosopher. That's as if a philosopher debating William Lane Craig was to say the universe is eternal, but it's a mystery as to why it's eternal. It'd be
Yeah,
the same
sure.
thing as a theologian saying that, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, so the question would be, so if I say, yeah, exactly, the universe just exists. I mean, and it's an infinite chain of contingent things. It just goes on forever in the past and the future. And there's no other explanation for it than that. You might say, well, look, that's not very satisfying as an explanation. And I might agree with you that it's not very satisfying. The question is the God explanation better? And if at the end of the day, it turns out that it's exactly the same, because God's decision, it has to be completely arbitrary for it to not be necessary, then the idea is it's just there isn't really any benefit to the God option. Right? It is the same as the contingency option. It's just with God being there whilst a contingent thing happens. So we're talking about like, is one preferable to the other? Well, in terms of explanation, the idea is that they're equivalent to each other.
Mm-hmm. If anything, one could violate Occam's razor, right?
Well, Occam's razor is often misused by people. I mean, so Occam's razor is something like if you have two exactly similar theories and one of them postulates more things than the other, then you should go with the one that postulates the fewer things. But and I did say that in terms of explanation, these two are the same as each other. But you might so on that basis, you might prefer the one which postulates the fewer things. But there might still be theoretical benefits to having God in the picture. It's just not in terms of explaining the ultimate existence of everything. I mean, maybe it makes you feel better or something, and maybe that's worth the ontological cost. That's a bit flippant, but maybe it plays another role, I'm saying. So Occam's razor really only works when everything else considered, the two theories are the same. But we're only looking forensically at one very small issue, and it would be unlikely that those two theories are exactly the same in every respect. And that's the only time it's valid to play the Occam's razor card. But I mean, yeah, if they were in fact exactly, if I don't know, the existence of a deist God, right, and the existence of no God basically seem to be the same. They don't, the deist God doesn't really do anything. And if it was that they were the same, even in terms of explanation, then yeah, Occam's razor does seem to suggest shaving the deist God off. I guess you're going to say that this theist God does something that distinguishes him from a deist God, and maybe that's what's going to keep him in our theory. Does that make sense?
So, yeah. So if the theist God doesn't have anything that helps the theory or helps explain whatever we're talking about, would that matter, or would that be irrelevant to whether we keep him as a possible explanation for whatever phenomenon we're talking about?
So look, if Occam's razor is when you're comparing theories against one another, right? So if you're saying that if let's say that maybe worldview is the right word here, but if my worldview with no God in it and my worldview with God in it were exactly the same in every single respect, right? No benefit to believing in God, no benefit to not believing in God, no downside on either case either. They don't result in me doing anything any differently. Neither provides any explanation any better than the other. In every single respect you can possibly imagine, they're exactly the same, but one of them posits the existence of God and the other one doesn't. Then Occam's razor works there, right?
Oh, okay.
If we're just talking about in terms of this specific argument, I'm now we're not comparing worldviews or theories. We're just saying we're just looking at whether the premises of the argument get us to the conclusion. right? And it seems to me that because there's this objection at the beginning to the argument, which is something like, well, or at least there's one of the options that the argument sees, the trilemma, right? It's that either there's a never-ending series of causes, or it terminates in an arbitrary contingent cause, or it terminates with this first cause of a necessary being. Because the third one is no better than either of the other two, I'm just simply saying that it isn't really a distinct third option. Right? It doesn't get you anything to go there. So I don't know if playing Occam's razor means that you shouldn't go there. If you have other reasons to go there, that's all I'm trying to say, then you might still want to do it, but you can't say that it's providing an explanation. It doesn't win on the explanation criteria, basically.
Okay. So there might be another reason why one would want to go the theist route, but it doesn't help explain anything.
I mean, say you have some personal experience that convinces you that God exists. That might be a reason to still think that God exists, and his decision to make the universe is the truth, right? But all I'm saying is, if we just consider these hypotheses one by one, and think about it without bringing everything else onto the table, like our own background experiences and stuff, it just doesn't do the job that it's supposed to do.
Right. So it doesn't help the argument in any way.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. So why don't we talk a bit about the moral argument? That was one we talked about last episode.
Mm-hmm.
So as Craig presents it, he says, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. But objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists.
Okay, so I mean, this is another massive area, right? So let's see if I can try and take a couple of considerations on this. Right? So, I mean, okay, so first of all, let's say we accept that objective moral duties and obligations exist, right? There are theories according to which those are properties of the universe. They're just there, right? Not all. So if you don't think that God exists, that doesn't mean that you think that everything which exists is material, for one thing, right? So there's a whole host of non-naturalist yet atheist theories of things. So you could have some kind of Platonic idea of what goodness is, right? That it's something which exists objectively in the world, like so numbers, for instance, right? There's philosophers of mathematics who take numbers to be things which exist independently of any. They're not material entities, right? They're the reference of the words 1 and 2 and 3 and stuff. They're the objects that mathematical theories are about, but they're not material things. So that you can be a non-materialist and an atheist, right? There's no reason why God has to exist for those types of theories. And you could just adopt one of those in the moral case as well. And there might just be a non-spatiotemporal thing that's called an obligation, and I'm just under it, right? I don't really see why. And you might say that that's implausible for various reasons, but it seems like that's on the table. And something like G. Moore, do you know Moore's naturalistic fallacy move? Do you know Moore?
No, I'm not too familiar with it.
Well, Moore thinks that the good is an indefinable, and it's not definable in terms of anything else, right? It's a kind of sui generis property. So let's say we observe things like being nice to old people is good, and giving to charities is good, and not torturing babies for no reason is good, and doing things like stealing from charities is bad, and hurting old people is bad, and whatever, right? We observe that there are these actions, and they share some kind of property. So there's something about being nice to old people and giving to charity and not torturing babies. There's something they all have in common, which is being good. And now, what Moore kind of confusingly calls a naturalist is someone who is going to try and reduce what that shared property is and explain it in terms of something else. So, for instance, a utilitarian wants to say something like the thing that those examples all have in common, the goodness that they have, is that they maximize pleasure or something, right? They minimize harm, something like this, maximize well-being or something. And the divine command theorist is going to say something like the thing that they all have in common is being commanded by God. The theistic hedonist is going to say something like the thing that they all have in common is that they're things that make God happy or something. Now Moore thinks that any explanation like that, which reduces those good properties, it reduces, like if somebody says, what is the good? And they say, oh, the good is such and such, and they give some criteria for what it means to be good, that they're open to this. You can always say, but is it good to minimize harm? Right? And that question has content to it. It's a meaningful thing to ask. And he thinks that that's enough to show that the good isn't identical to reducing harm. Because if it was, then the question should be like saying, but is the good good? Right? Because that's not really a sensible question, right? The answer is trivially, obviously, yes. But if you say, but is it good? Is the good reducing harm? You might say, well, maybe, maybe not, right? At least it seems like something that's a substantial question. So there's this idea that it's the open, so he calls defining the good in terms of something else the naturalistic fallacy, because he thinks
is this called the open-ended question? Now that you just described it, I think I've came across it.
Yeah, right. So he thinks that because identity statements are analytic, right? So if I say A is B, that it's a matter of meaning, definition, right? And because no sentence, the good is X, is ever true by definition. It's only ever true by kind of stipulation or something. It seems like it's a non-analytic truth. That shows that the good isn't identical to anything. Right? The good is a sui generis concept. It's not reducible to anything. I mean, on that view, right, the good is just some simple, undefinable fact. And so saying that the good is what is commanded by God is to commit a fallacy, the naturalistic fallacy. Just as it is to say that the good is reducing harm or promoting pleasure or something. So, I mean, if Craig wants to argue that you can't have good without there being God there, presumably something like a divine command theory, then he's going to have to say something about how he's going to have to get around this open question argument. And he's committed to the good not being a sui generis type of thing. But anyway, this is one type of consideration. It's not, I don't think that that's utterly decisive. I think that I like the idea of a different way of thinking about ethics in the first place, right? And there are other ways of thinking about ethics. So one of them is to think about things like in terms of virtue ethics, right? So according to something like Aristotelian view, what's important isn't the prohibition or sanctioning of particular actions, but the cultivation of certain types of character traits, right? And I'm sympathetic to this idea. So it's something like, if, let's see, okay, so you might say something like the benefit of virtue ethics as opposed to a rule-following kind of morality system is that the rule-following system is kind of childlike in comparison. And here's what I mean by that, right? Of course, when you're learning how to behave properly, you need rules to tell you what to do and what not to do. But part of being an adult is having a certain type of temperament or attitude, which means that you're not simply just applying rules, right? But that you're thinking about things responsibly, making up your own mind according to your own kind of sound judgment. And that those two things kind of pull in opposite directions, right? You can't rely entirely on there being certain prescriptions and commandments and also think responsibly for yourself. right? You have to sort of switch between those two different ways of doing things if you want to have both of them together. And Aristotle's idea is something like that there's 4 grades of ethical person. So on the bottom, there's a person who's like a beast or something, who just like by intuition does the wrong thing. So they steal and rape and are violent to one another kind of instinctively, like a beast or something. And then there's a person who is aware of rules of society and codes of conduct and stuff, but doesn't do them, doesn't follow them through. It's still too beast-like. He knows about stuff, but he's not really accepted it. And then there's the 3rd grade, sorry, it's someone who knows about it and then follows those rules as well. Right? But the 4th grade, the phronimos, this is this kind of moral, the saint or something like this, ethically perfect, or at least adult person, simply internalizes the principles themselves and has become a good person. They're not just someone who reliably does the right thing, but they're someone who's doing the right things as instinctive to them as the doing of violence was to the beast. Right? They are a good person, and that results in them doing the right thing, right? Because that's how they want to be. Right? That's just what they're like, something. And I don't really see why, on that view, we need to postulate abstract principles like, commandment that it's wrong to kill or something. It just kind of pops out that people with the right temperament don't do those types of things once they've achieved this level of moral adulthood. And 1 or 2 more words on this. The idea is something like, look, you've got these situations where you have poles of wrongness, right? So in a war situation or something, you can suffer from 2 different types of vice, right? You can be too cowardly, and that means you're hiding in the trenches and letting your friends die when you could be helping them and stuff like this, right? It's kind of cowardice. And then there's the other vice, which is like too brave, right? You run headlong into machine gun fire and give away the position of your friends and buddies and stuff by being too brave, right? Too brave or not brave enough form these 2 kind of poles. And Aristotle's idea is, you need to be in the middle, right? There's an appropriate amount of bravery. It's not too brave and it's not too cowardly, right? And the virtue that he identifies is really always just the appropriate amount of whichever scale we're looking at. So if it's selfishness, or you can be too selfish, you can be too generous, right? You can be too brave, you can be too cowardly, you can be too gluttonous, you can be too what's the opposite of gluttonous? You can be too frugal, or whatever it is, right? And the right thing to do in every case is to be the right amount of whatever character type we're talking about. Like not too much, not too little. So it's finding that
moderation.
Sorry?
It would be moderation in all circumstances, basically.
Yeah, moderation. I mean, nothing's really out of bounds completely, but nothing should be indulged in too much, right? And exactly how to fill that out doesn't have any prescription. Right? There's no way that you can say in advance exactly what the right amount of cowardice is in every single situation. Right? You couldn't write down a book of commandments that told you in every single case exactly how much cowardice would be right. You have to be a responsible thinking adult that's internalized the idea and has developed the right type of character to get to this point. And anyway, I'm really just outlining that there's a completely different view on ethics.
So Craig's argument would rely on deontological ethics or rule-based ethics, it seems to you?
Yeah, I mean, and I don't really see, I don't find it particularly plausible in the first place, but it does seem to be just excluding a massive tradition in ethics right from the get-go without any argument for that. Right? I don't know, maybe if you already agree that virtue ethics is wrong, I don't really see how you could, I'm not really sure what sort of argument you could use.
From what I've read of Craig, he adopts virtue ethics, but he combines it with deontological ethics. So I guess his idea is something like there's a set of rules you have to follow, and you have to be the type of person that follows them habitually, or something like that.
Well, I mean, sure, maybe there's a nuance there that I'm not aware of, but in principle, the idea of the phronimos is someone who's not strictly bound by rules, right? He would never let the presence of an absolute rule get in the way of applying the right amount of whatever it is. So I mean, so the idea is just that, in some context, so if someone's about to push the nuclear button or whatever that's going to destroy everyone, then yeah, sure, it might be right to just smash them over the head. Right? The prohibition that you should never murder can be over, and the phronimos would know that, right? They would have internalized the right attitude, and they just do the right thing instinctively because they're kind of nice, reliable, kind of sound type of person. So I'm not really sure how you can completely, they seem to me that they point in opposite directions, and there must be some concession at some point, which I'd be curious to see how that works. I mean, it's not a biblical idea anyway to be virtue ethics. It's not biblical, it seems to me. It doesn't work. How does it work with the 10 Commandments, right? 10 Commandments don't say, well, yeah, you can do that, but only the right amount of murder, right? It's no murder, right? There's no middle ground on that. So seems to me that those two things pull in the opposite direction. But anyway, let's just leave virtue ethics to one side. So far I've said I think that there are non-naturalistic views of morality, and there's Moore's problem for any explanation of morality, which reduces it to something else. And there's virtue ethics, which seems to be on the table as well. But then if we just look at the positive account of morality, which is that, seems to me, if it's divinely grounded, I think that you run into a Euthyphro problem immediately, right? So however you cash it out, if it's the good is whatever's commanded by God, or the good is whatever is pleasing to God or something, you immediately run into the issue of whether or not is this thing pleasing to God because it's good, or is it just good in virtue of the fact that it's pleasing to God, right? That's basically the original Euthyphro dilemma. And obviously on the first horn, if this is pleasing to God because it's good, that means that it's independent, it's good independently of God. And that seems to mean that the whole idea that the goodness is related to God is undermined, right? God just likes good things, but their goodness exists as a Platonic object or something. And so my relation to the good is only mediated irrelevantly by God being there in between the two. I may as well just like the good things myself as well. It doesn't really matter that God likes them. So on that horn, the independence of good and God undermines God's position. He becomes a kind of pointless postman that just gives me the letter which tells me what's good, right? On the other hand, if something is simply good because it's liked by God or because it's commanded by God, then the problem seems to be something like arbitrariness, right? Well, charity is good, but rape is bad. But if God had commanded rape instead of charity, or whatever, if rape was pleasing to God instead of charity, then that would be good. That's all it takes to be good, right? There's nothing about being good that makes it good, apart from it being pleasing to God or commanded by God, makes the whole thing seem completely arbitrary. So those two horns seem to make the divine explanation in that case unsatisfactory. So I don't even buy the positive case that Craig seems to be putting forward, or at least that kind of.
So in Craig's idea to respond to that would be to say that just that the good is that which God does or whatever, but it still produces the same problem.
Yeah, I mean, so there's this, I've seen him refer to this Alston view, which is that the good is has some kind of relationship to God's nature. So God is good by nature or something. And yeah, I think you're quite right that whichever escape route you try to take, we just run the original dilemma again, right? Is God's nature, so let's say God is charitable by nature or something, and that's why God commands charity, right? Because he's charitable and he wants us to be charitable too. But then you want to say, well, why is God charitable? Is God's nature, nature, if charity is part of God's nature, why is charity part of God's nature? Why not vengefulness or rapefulness, or whatever the word is, right? Well, if charity is part of God's nature because charity is independently of God a good thing, then we're right back to the same first horn of the dilemma, which seems to separate the two things out again. Right? But then again, if charity is only, so what's the other horn there? That charity is part of God's nature, or charity is good simply in virtue of being part of God's nature.
Right, because God is good. But then God's goodness is unintelligible.
Well, no, because God's goodness is already being cashed out in terms of God's possession of charity as part of his nature. And we're asking why charity is part of his nature. If it's because charity is good, then that makes it arbitrary. But then what even is the other alternative? Seems to me that it's just, we just have to say, look, charity just is part of God's nature. And there can't be any, I mean, or maybe charity is part of God's nature because charity feels good for God to have as part of his nature. But we're in a never-ending cycle here, because, well, why does it feel good for God, for charity to be part of his nature? Is it because charity is good and he likes having good things as part of his nature? Well, no, because that would make charity good independently of God again. So why does God like having charity as part of his nature? You know, that doesn't have any explanation again. We can summon up some other thing, right? That like some other thing other than, I know, his preference and his nature. We could keep adding something in there, but it seems to me we're not really addressing the root of the problem, which is that there's no fundamental reason to connect the moral value with God. Where there's nothing about God that means that something about him has to be construed as goodness. So like, if I take the same thing, let's say we're trying to run this argument, but for numbers or something, right? And so if I say something like, I think that the number one just exists independently, or I'm a Platonist about numbers, and you want to say something like, no, oneness only exists because God commanded it to be the first number or something, right? And then I say, okay, well, did God command 1 to be the first number because it is the first number? Or is it the first number only because God commanded it, right? This feels wrong already, right? Like, obviously it can't be, it must be the first horn, right? And if you try and say something like, well, no, 1 is only the first number in virtue of God commanding it, it feels like there couldn't be any reason between. There's nothing about being commanded to be the first number that could make 1 the first number, right? It doesn't seem like it even makes sense for anything other than 1 to be the first number, right? What would it even mean if God had said 2 is the first number? So it couldn't be anything other than what it is, right? At least it doesn't seem to make sense. So that option, there couldn't be a connection between a command by somebody and the thing that the command is supposed to be, in this case, actually like coming about. And I think that same, it's slightly less obvious, but I think that that's the same thing that's going on here with the moral value. Like, it couldn't be that something about God makes it the case that charity is good. Like, those two things are completely like ontologically distinct from one another. At least it seems to me that it's less plausible that there could be a connection there than the original kind of slightly lame idea that the good is whatever promotes well-being or something. At least I can understand how well-being makes people feel better. But just once we're talking about like, we're just hypothesizing merely for the sake of argument that God has certain like personality traits and that's what grounds the whole thing. For me, it just seems like it's not even trying to address the issue at any point. So I don't know. I feel like this Euthyphro thing doesn't establish conclusively that it can't make sense, but I do think that it opens a rabbit trail that will basically never end, because I don't see how at any step. I mean, if we want to address the issue, we should be able to do it the first step. And by just saying, oh, it's part of his nature, it's part of his character or something, we're just putting it off. A bit like with what I say is happening with the contingency argument. It looks like a third option, but actually it just isn't a third option.
Right. So the same problem happens as soon as you apply it to God. You're just pushing the problem a step further back.
Yeah. Exactly.
So Craig has the first premise, which is if God doesn't exist, objective moral values and duties don't exist. But to me, this seems a lot like the transcendental argument, in which he's saying only God can account for these things. And then he lists like, well, naturalism can't do it, and he gives his reasons why. And then he thinks that establishes the conclusion. So to me, it seems like he never actually establishes the first premise. Would you agree with that, or?
Yeah, I mean, so like I said, I don't. Well, what's his reason for naturalism not being able to? By naturalism, what do we mean? That the material world,
like materialism, or the matter is all that exists. And then he'll say, like, well, I can't think of anything that could ontologically ground objective moral values and duties. Therefore, we'll just discard the idea that there could be objective moral values and duties on naturalism.
I see. So naturalism isn't the. So there seems to me there's a false dichotomy between. It sounds like these are two mutually exclusive and exhaustive categories, right? They're supernatural and natural. Actually, they're not, because there can be supernatural as in non-material personal agents, and natural meaning everything is kind of somehow reducible to, there's different ways of putting it, but the material world or something, right? But then there are other categories in between those as well. Like some people argue that intentional states are not physical, but they're not really the same as distinct, like non-physical minds as such. It's just a kind of distinct category. And as I said before, you have a kind of Platonist view where there are non-physical, non-personal things. So even if you eliminated, so it seems to me that a lot of the time with apologetics, what you've got is, either God exists, or the option is only this kind of 18th century mechanical view of atoms bouncing around under Newtonian clockwork rules, right? It's either that, or there's a supernatural personal agent that's responsible for things, and there are just other options than those, and so you don't get to establish that God exists by ruling out this kind of crude mechanistic materialism. I don't think that crude mechanistic materialism is true. I don't really know. I don't really claim to know what the world is like at its most fundamental level, but that means that I don't claim to know that it's material at its ultimate fundamental level, nothing but material. There could be other things going on out there. Like I said, any of these other non-natural positions. So any apologetical argument that relies upon proving that God exists by excluding sort of crude materialism is making this same false dichotomy. It's kind of presuppositional Greg Banson fallacy or whatever, which is that you can just prove that God exists by ridiculing reductive materialism. Like, it's like a terrible, terrible argument.
I agree.
If he wanted to sufficiently establish the first premise or support it, he wouldn't just have to attack materialism or naturalism. He'd have to attack a wide range of ideas that lack the existence of God. And once you send it to that, the argument becomes a lot more difficult to support, because there's a lot of things you have to attack.
Yeah, I mean, so that kind of crude materialism is actually almost just a straw man. I'm not sure that really anyone holds that view about absolutely everything. Or at least people, let's be a bit more specific. I don't think any kind of respected philosopher really holds that type of view. So just take a couple of like really obvious problem cases. Right? If you're convinced that everything is made of matter and material, or let's say you're convinced that either everything is made of material or it's made of some spirit substance, right? That there's two substances. I think that the person who takes either one of those two views, the kind of materialist or the supernaturalist, what do you do with things like opportunities, right? I say things like, there is an opportunity for a promotion at work. What's an opportunity? Is that made of matter? Is it made of spirit substance? No, obviously, but if not, then what do you do with that? I mean, are you saying that that doesn't exist then? Should I stop saying things like there are opportunities? Or you've got a nice haircut, you might say to someone. Is a haircut a physical thing? I mean, it seems like a shape of a physical thing. Like my hair is physical. Is my haircut physical? That doesn't seem right, but it's obviously not a spiritual substance either. So, I mean, philosophers are not going to be so easily pigeonholed into saying, oh, there's only one type of thing and it's matter, or at least not outside the kind of introductory class. It's very difficult to know exactly what the ontological status of things are. I mean, and look at the development of things in theoretical physics, even physics, which is supposed to be restricted to things that you can actually sort of measure and calculate. You know, it's supposed to be the kind of definition of the physical world, but it's called physics, for goodness sake. Even in that, we have strange things like fields and energy and whatever, right? The subatomic particles that don't really have any location and stuff. None of these things are categorically matter, nor are they spiritual substance either. So it's only a childish drawing of ontology to think that those are the, you know, that anyone really takes those types of categories seriously. It seems to me. Anyone who's thinking responsibly about this has to just sort of take a much more cautious view. And whilst we're going to entertain these types of arguments for what things are and what type of things there are, you know, no one's going to be dogmatic about there definitely is only material objects and nothing else. It just strikes me as a very immature and unrealistic way of approaching these things. I mean, when it comes to ontology and metaphysics in general, you should have your mind open to there being lots of different types of things. And you shouldn't ever really be too convinced about any one of them that you're thinking about. It seems to me that there's, I mean, I've said this a few times, but there's lots of different types of dogma, but there's only one way to be non-dogmatic. Right? So you could be dogmatically materialistic or dogmatically whatever, deterministic or Platonistic or whatever. You can just stick to it and say, no, this is right, definitely this, and nothing else is right. But there's only one way to be open-minded, and that's to just not do any of those things, right? And it's really only the open-minded people that are thinking about it like an adult, like responsibly, and actually weighing things up properly. Otherwise, you just closed your mind off to all of the actual interesting debate. And you know, the first rule of philosophy club is anything you think you're right about, you're probably not right about. Right? You need to keep your mind open. That's a kind of Socratic principle, right? So Socrates' insight was that everybody else thought that they knew stuff, and he realized that he didn't, and that made him wiser than everybody else. And that's the philosophical mindset, is that you shouldn't go around thinking that you know what everything is like. So just to circle back, the idea that there's this, or there's the materialist and there's the religious person or something. Maybe a really terrible instance of a religious person is someone who's so dogmatic that they, in addition to thinking that they know that God exists, they also think they know all of the ontological categories for everything that exists as well. I mean, that strikes me as absurd, right? That the Bible doesn't tell you anything about whether fields exist, or whether opportunities are things that exist, or whether haircuts should be considered physical objects. It just doesn't say anything about those things. So it just doesn't come with your religion that you have a full ontology or a full theory of physics. And you know, I don't know. It just, yeah.
But
sorry.
That's kind of the idea that presuppositionalists give off sometimes, as if like the Bible can explain anything in the universe, and then they try to find obscure passages from the Bible to try to ground something like induction or whatever.
Yeah.
And it just seems like they're pushing it way too far than what's even possible.
Definitely, yeah. So how many arguments did we cover so far? We've done
so far, I think only 2. Wait, kalam. Well, I mean 3, kind of, if you count Leibniz kalam. I mean Leibniz cosmological argument. I guess we can talk about the ontological argument. I know you're a pretty big fan of that one.
Okay, well, there's also different types of ontological argument. So they're originally put forward by Anselm, So that argument is phrased in lots of different ways, even this argument itself, but it's something along the lines of God is, by definition, a thing than which none greater can be conceived, right? And then the idea is that if so you want to say something like God, one way of cashing this out is that God has all great making properties to their maximal extent, right? So knowing stuff is great making, and if you're something greater than which nothing can be conceived, then you don't just know certain things and are ignorant of others, but you know everything, right? That seems to be the maximal extent of that property of knowledge, is knowing everything, right? So this maximal being has maximal knowledge, and the same with power. If you can do some things but not others, then you're not a maximal being. You have to be able to do everything, blah blah blah, right? So we get through these list of properties that we could think of as a perfectly great being would have to have, and then the idea is, well, if this being that we've just been talking about, if that was just something that was in our minds, if it was just an idea of a thing that didn't actually exist, then it would be lacking in a great making property, right, which is existing. So it would have to actually exist as well. It couldn't just be a potential being or a conceptual being or something, an idea of something. It'd have to actually exist. And then it seems to be that the idea of the perfect maximal being has to exist, right? That it has to be part of its definition that this thing actually exists. And because we can entertain the idea in our minds, that means that this thing that we're entertaining when we think about it actually does exist. And so even the fool who says within his heart that there is no God or something, when he's saying that there is no God, the thing that he's saying about is God. And if he knew what he was saying properly when he said that, he'd be saying that there is no maximal perfect being. But a maximal perfect being has to exist. Therefore, God does in fact exist. Right? That seems to be. Do you want to? Does that sound right to you? The way that you've heard the argument made before?
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah.
Okay, so, and then obviously there are lots of different versions of this. Plantinga's resurrected it in a contemporary setting. Kant and Russell's put forward this argument against this. I think Kant does as well, against Anselm's version of the argument, which is that essentially existing isn't really a property. Right? It's not like knowing stuff. You can be in. If I know that this is a mug or something, that it seems like that's a genuine property that I have. And then saying that I don't know that this is a mug or something is like me not having that property. So it seems like the knowledge of that thing being a mug is a property that I either have or don't have, and that makes sense. But when it comes to existence, the idea is something like, if you say this mug exists, you're not really adding a property onto it, right? Because if I say this mug doesn't exist, then as we were talking about before, with this is kind of going back right to the beginning of it. It's a negative existential. It doesn't really seem like what I've said makes any sense, right? This mug doesn't exist. Well, if that's true, then there isn't any mug, right? So then what does this mug mean at the beginning of the sentence? So it's almost a contradiction in terms to say of something that doesn't exist. But if that's true, then to say of something that it does exist is a tautology, right? It's just an empty truism. And if that's right, then existing isn't a property like other properties, like being half full of coffee or something, right? That is certainly not a contradiction to say that it's not half full of coffee, and it's not a tautology to say that it is, right? It seems like a substantial truth. So if that's right, then the property of existence is very different from these other types of properties, and to the extent that it isn't really a property at all, right? It's just another way of saying something like there is a mug, right? If you say there is a mug and there is an existing mug, you've just said the same thing twice, right? You haven't added a thing on by saying there is an existing mug. Whereas if I say there is a mug and there is a red mug, And the second one is adding more information in. But the first could be sort of plausibly construed as just being the same thing, like saying there's a mug and there's an existing mug. And if that's right, then existence isn't really a property. And if it isn't really a property, then it's also not a great-making property.
So
and if that's right, then it doesn't work in the argument.
In the way Plantinga cast the argument in modal logic, doesn't he still assume that existence is a property and great-making property? And then he says, well, if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, it must exist in every possible world.
Yeah. Okay, so Plantinga's argument is quite different.
Well, real quick, just to like end on, I mean, not to end, but just to comment on Saint Anselm's. So would you say that since it doesn't necessarily make sense to say existing is a great making property, it resorts to just being a sort of unjustified assertion? He's just saying God exists, therefore God exists?
I'm not sure if it comes down to that. But what it's doing is it's saying, so what it's challenging is that there's this idea that, well, with some properties, that properties can be split into great making and not great making. So being lazy isn't a great making property. And that's why we're not going to say that God is maximally lazy, right? He's not in any sense lazy, because it's not a great making property. So we'll put laziness into this pile over here, but then we'll put, generous. Plausibly being maximally generous, let's say, is great making. Although, to be honest, I just don't find that plausible, because as I was talking about before with the poles of vice and virtue, it just doesn't seem right that being maximally charitable is a great making property. Let's pick a different one. All knowing, right? That does seem like plausibly it's better to be more knowing than less knowing or something. So knowing everything makes you greater than knowing fewer things. So let's put that knowing things, or the property of knowing X or something, in the other pile from lazy. So that's in the great making property. And then when it comes around to existing, you want to ask, well, which pile does this property go into? The response is that it doesn't really go into either pile, because it's not a property at all. The question of whether it's a great making property or not doesn't apply to this thing, right? It's just a kind of turn of phrase that doesn't actually indicate the possession of a property by any object, right? It looks like it does on the surface, like grammatically. You want to say, I could say James is male and James is existing, or something. Like structurally, they look like the word existing and male playing a similar role in the sentence. But when you run through the considerations I was just outlining before, they actually operate very differently. It seems like, conceptually speaking, existence plays a completely different role to other types of properties. So it's not that saying that God exists, therefore God. I don't see how it boils down to that, but it does mean that the jump from saying that there's like a maximal being or something, perfect being, plausibly has to have all of these properties. Like he's plausibly all-knowing, but not, and plausibly not lazy. But then it blocks the jump from, well, he plausibly exists then, because existence is a great making property. It sort of stops the argument there and says no. So basically what it's saying is, you can define a great being if you want, but that doesn't mean that that thing exists. It's still a kind of something like an empirical matter or a synthetic claim, not an analytic claim. It doesn't follow from the meaning of your entity that it exists. However you define an entity, it still has to be a fact or not about whether it exists. It can't follow just from the meaning. So it's like you can't just define it into existence or something. Right? It doesn't follow just from the definition of something that it exists. I don't know if that actually answers your question any better.
Yeah, that does. So, so now we can move on to Plantinga's modal ontological argument.
Okay, so let's see if I can. Oh, damn it! See if I can remember the premises. Okay, so the planting, as far as I remember, it's been a while since I looked at it, but my dog actually ate half of Naming and Nature of Necessity a few months ago. So I think she ate the bit that had the argument in it.
If you want, I could spell out the argument for you.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, great.
Yeah. So it might not be word for word, but premise one is it is possible that a maximally great being exists. Premise two, if a maximally great being exists, oh shoot, hold up. Wait, it's escaping my mind as well. Yeah.
It's if it's possible a maximally great being exists. If it's possible a maximally great being exists, it exists in some possible world. If a maximally great being exists in some possible world, it exists in every possible world. If a maximally great being exists in every possible world, it exists in the actual world. Therefore, a maximally great being exists. Something like that.
So, and then the idea is that a maximally great being is one whose existence is necessary, right? Because that's how you have to have the argument running to get from it existing in some world, right? So maybe if I said, look, yeah, there's a maximally existing being in some possible world, right? But it doesn't exist in all possible worlds. That's to say that it's a contingently existing being, right? Because contingency just means true in some world, but not in every world, right? So for Plantinga's argument, it needs to be the case that a maximally great being not only exists, but necessarily exists, right? So with what we're saying when we say maximally existing, maximally perfect being is a necessarily existing being, as well as a bunch of other stuff, right? All good and all knowing, blah, blah, blah. So we can just say it's possible that a necessarily existing being exists. If a necessarily existing being, if it's possible that a necessarily existing being exists, then it exists in at least some possible world. But if a necessarily existing being exists in at least one possible world, it exists in all possible worlds. Therefore, it exists in this world, right? That's basically how the argument goes. And I think you mentioned this objection in the first place, which is that that seems like on its face that there's just as much reason to think that a necessarily existing that there aren't any necessarily existing beings and that there are, right? Maybe it's not possible that a necessarily existing being exists. And if it's not possible that a necessarily existing being exists, then there's at least one world where a necessarily existing being doesn't exist. But if there's one world where a necessarily existing being doesn't exist, it doesn't exist at all possible worlds. Therefore, it's not a necessarily existing being, therefore it doesn't exist in this world either, right? So the intuition that gets you started could go in either direction. And I think Plantinga actually admits that that's the case, right? It's not actually decisive. It's a way of articulating confidence that you might have if you already buy the idea that a necessary existing being exists, that God exists. It's a way of cashing that out. But you need to swallow the pill in the first premise in order to continue.
I think he says he thinks it's a sound argument, but he acknowledges that the first premise can't really be supported unless you already think God exists.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that I also want to quibble about the notion of modality that's involved in the first premise, right? Because there's different meanings to the word possible, of course, right? So if I say that something, let's say traveling faster than the speed of light is not physically possible, right? And what that means is something like the laws of physics don't allow it, right? So a thing traveling faster than the speed of light and the laws of physics equals a contradiction, right? There's some thing that in laws of physics that forbids that from happening, right? It's contradicting that. On the other hand, it's not logically impossible, right? If I'm not thinking about the laws of physics and I'm just thinking about some more abstract set of laws, like laws of classical logic, there's nothing in that says that things can't travel faster than the speed of light. So we might say something like, while a particle traveling faster than the speed of light is physically impossible, it's not logically impossible, right? So we've got like at least two grades of modality already, physical and logical. Plantinga wants to be talking about what philosophers call metaphysical modality. and this is already very unclear what metaphysical modality means. It's something slightly stronger than physical modality, but it's not quite as strong as logical modality. So let's say something like, I'm not sure if this is the right way to put it, but, well, let me see what's Kripke's. In the ancient Babylonian world, right, the Babylonian astronomers would be looking out at the morning star and the evening star, right? And at that point, they didn't realize that those two things were both Venus. So from their perspective, it was at least possible, and they thought true, that the morning star is not the evening star. In actual fact, because the morning star and the evening star always referred, although unknowingly by those people, always referred to the same object, it was supposed to be sort of metaphysically impossible for the morning star to not be the evening star. And what's going on there is that there's a distinction between what appears possible to somebody and what is in actual fact possible. Right, so we're distinguishing between another two grades of modality, right? The epistemic modality, right? What's true for all I know, and what's true in actual fact, and the actual basis being what's out there in the world rather than what's in my head. And it's not quite clear to me. So I guess, for all I know, there is a necessarily existing being, right? So in a sense, it's epistemically possible that there's a necessarily existing being. But is it? Am I in the position of the ancient Babylonian astronomer who thinks that Venus, that the morning star isn't the evening star, is possible, when actually it isn't? Right? I mean, maybe it's not possible that there's a necessarily existing being. For all I know, I don't know everything about metaphysics, right? Maybe there's something that I'm not getting which rules that out. Maybe there's some kind of reverse ontological argument, which means that there couldn't be one, right? And that's a matter of necessity. Well, so I'm only going to grant the first premise if what we're talking about is epistemic modality. I mean, sure, it's epistemically possible that there's a necessarily existing being, right? To say it even more stiltedly, it's epistemically possible, as in, for all I know, it's possible, that there is a being whose existence is metaphysically necessary, right? Who in actual fact couldn't not exist. Right? That might be the case for all I know, but also, for all I know, that might not be the case. I don't know, right? I'm ignorant over whether or not, the crucial first premise, is that actually something that reality is minded to permit, or whatever the hell we mean by metaphysical modality. Like, I just don't know whether I should grant that first premise. I think, well, I'm minded to say that because I don't know one way or the other, it's epistemically possible either direction. But if you're saying, oh, is it metaphysically possible? So the first premise is, it's true that it's metaphysically possible that there's a metaphysically necessary being. Well, I can't grant that premise, right? Because I need some kind of argument in order to give it, right? I don't know whether that's true or not. Maybe it's false. So what's the argument that grounds that first premise and makes it the case that it is metaphysically possible that this type of being exists? Well, I think if you could answer that question, you'd already have such great knowledge of metaphysics that you'd know whether God existed, right? We're talking about whether a metaphysically necessary being is metaphysically possible or not. Now, it seems to me that's an impossible to answer question unless you already have unlocked the kind of deepest secrets of how the world works. And it kind of trades on an ambiguity between my willingness to grant that I don't know whether that's true, which is epistemic, and it being a fact in the world that, that's real, a metaphysical possibility. And, I will give you the epistemic possibility, but I won't give you the metaphysical one. And then the problem is that once we're doing epistemic possibility, you can't then say, oh, we're using S5, which is the step that he has to take from it at the end to get it to exist in this world as well. I mean, it just might not be true. If we're using an epistemic modality, it becomes a lot more complicated. It's certainly just not straightforwardly obvious that you're going to be that S5 step's going to work. So that's my own particular bugbear with I mean, and you think you can still apply all of the same objections that you could apply to Anselm. I don't really get what difference it makes to those things. I mean, look, for one thing, yeah, is existence a great making property? That's debatable, obviously, but here's another thought, which is that greatness itself has to be a certain type of scale for this argument to work, right? Which is like, it has to be the type of thing which admits of maximal elements in the first place. So let's take numbers, for instance. Numbers are ordered by a relation which mathematicians call the greater than relation. I mean, it's not the same type of greatness, right? But it has the same name. And it's illustrative of the idea of there being a relation that doesn't have a greatest upper bound, or a least upper bound, or an upper bound of any description, right? The 2 is greater than 1, 3 is greater than 2, right? That's the ordering that numbers have. It's a linear ordering. Every 2 numbers, one's greater than the other. Now, there's no number such that it's a number greater than which none can be conceived. Right? Any number you pick, I can pick another one, right? I can pick another one which is greater than that number, right? Any x, there's an x plus 1 is a number. So it's a greaterness relation that doesn't admit of a maximal element. Now, why should, even if we grant that there are great making properties, let's say that being all powerful is a great, say that being powerful is a great making property. Why should it be the case that there's a maximal limit of all powerful? Maybe that doesn't make sense. Maybe that's like saying the greatest number, right? So you can say those words. It doesn't mean that it actually corresponds to a concept. So it's at least plausible, it seems to me, that for any greatness that you can come up with, I can just add, I can conceive of something that's, so you go, well, like my God can, lift this many suns or something. I'll just say, okay, well, I can think of one, I can lift that many, but with one more, something like, why isn't it the case that I can always think of something that's more powerful than any given example of something that you pick, right? So I'm not even, you have, for this description, the beginning of this whole idea is that there's this, that great making terminates in some kind of maximal element. And that just seems to me wildly implausible. I mean, there's 2 types of relation, right? There's ones that have upper limits and there's ones that don't. Like numbers is ones that don't. I mean, so an example of the other type is being more northern, right? So for any 2 points on the surface of the Earth, one is either more northern than the other, or the other way around, or they're equilateral, right? But there's a maximal point, which is the North Pole, and there's no point on the surface of the Earth which is more northern than the North Pole. It's more northern than every other point. There's no point that's equilateral with it. The absolute pinpoint part of the Earth that's the most north, right? And then there's so north has a terminal maximal point, but being a greater number doesn't. There's no top number like there is maximally north point on the surface of the Earth. So given that there's those 2 types of relations, which does being powerful fit into? It's not clear to me that it fits into being more like north than being more like greater number. In fact, it seems more like being a greater number. I don't know whether being all-knowing fits in one or the other, but it's not clear to me that it does. I already think that being it's quite clear that being more generous, you can always conceive of something that's more generous than another thing. And I don't see how that can terminate in a maximally generous thing. There's just like instances of greater and greater generosity. And anyway, it seems to me that being over a certain amount is detrimental, and too generous is such a thing, right? So maximally generous, even if it made sense, doesn't seem desirable. And yet that's supposed to be a great making property of God. So
I guess regarding things like all powerful or all knowing, the idea that maximal power or all powerful would be God's ability to do anything logically possible, or in terms of all knowing, he knows all true propositions. So would that be a terminal point, or is it possible to conceive of something greater than that?
Well, yeah. So if I can think of a God that can do contradictory things, is that worse? And why is that worse? And anyway, being able to do all things logically possible. So I mean, this is a really old paradox, but then if that's all there is to it, then there's things that God can't do, right? Like making the stone that's too heavy for him to lift. But that seems like a kind of strange limitation. And maybe it's logically, and maybe there's some like weird logical problem with that. But I can certainly conceive of something who can do that. So it's not something greater than which none can be conceived. I mean, I just said it out loud for one thing. I mean, even if I'm entertaining a contradiction when I do so, I seem to be able to conceive of something doing that. So why is that not greater? Or, you know, if God's bound by the laws of logic, say, well, pick a set of laws of logic, and then I'll just give you I'll give you a weaker system that has less laws in it. If God's bounded by, so I don't know, say classical logic, let's just say for argument's sake that it had 3 laws, which isn't the right way of thinking about these things, but okay, well, I'll just give you a weaker logic that has 2 laws in it. So now my God, which can do everything logically permissible, can do more than yours can, because there's a different type of logic that's at least potential. It's on the table. So I just don't feel like we're on solid ground here. It feels like we're just running around inside a word game where the apologists have been trying to juice this for as much mileage as they can get out of it, but we're not resting our feet on anything solid and firm whatsoever, right? I mean, I'm just plucking counterexamples out of thin air, and I think that's where the original argument came from as well. So I'm not particularly impressed.
Right. So we can keep going and like take a different set of logic and say, well, my God is better because he's not as bound as your God is.
Yeah. Illogical God who's not bound by logic at all, who can do even the logically impossible things. I don't know, is that better? It seems like he can do more.
Well, is there any way to even prove what is or is not better, or is it more something that someone would believe intuitively, like they think, I don't think a great God would be able to do contradictory things, or vice versa, or something like that.
Yeah, right. And I do. And then how do we know which one is right? Greatness is an inherently subjective notion, it seems.
Yeah, so there's not really any way to convince somebody of it, unless you could maybe give them counterexamples that show that there's some contradiction in their definition of greatness, or that they really do believe that this is a great thing, but they're claiming it's not.
Yeah. But, I mean, absent those things, and anyway, so let's say we had a conversation and I didn't think that being maximally generous was a great making property, and then you convinced me that it is. Does that actually mean that it is? Or does that just mean that I now agree with you?
It would just mean you would agree with me.
Yeah. So there's a difference here between persuasion and proof, right? What are we trying to do? I mean, any method of persuasion which isn't actually guaranteeing that the thing's true is inherently less persuasive once that penny's dropped. So I mean, if you manage to persuade someone, say you manage to persuade me, that generosity is a great making property, and then James pipes up, well, that doesn't actually mean it's true. That just means now that you agree with Dylan, I'm actually going to go, oh yeah, that's right. I'm now less persuaded by what you've just done there as a tactic for trying to establish that God exists. Right? It's undermined by the very fact that it's not really a method of proof. So the problem is what we're doing is we're just talking about subjective notion, and getting you to persuade me to change my subjective notion so that it agrees with yours is never really gonna. We're just dancing around the topic. It's supposed to be a proof that God exists. It's not supposed to be a series of things that you can say which makes me agree with you. And those are 2 different things, right? They look quite similar, of course, but they're not the same thing.
Right. So if I'm just using it as a tool to change your subjective notion to match mine, then it's just a piece of rhetoric and it's not a proof for anything.
Yeah, exactly. You may as well put a gun to my head or
Yeah.
drug me. Or something.
Don't give us any ideas, Alex.
Okay, so do you want to talk about the resurrection then?
Yes.
Sure. Yeah.
I think when I joined the Google Hangout, I think I overheard you speaking with Dylan with regards to the problem of miracles, and I think I did a very bad job at explaining it. So if you want, you could explain that as well and just correct where I messed up last episode.
Okay, so we're already 2 hours in, so I'm going to be about another half an hour, I think, at the most. But so let's see. So the idea is that there is. So let's just look at Hume's argument for the time being, right? Hume's argument was not that miracles are impossible, therefore you shouldn't believe a miracle argument, a claim of testimony to a miracle, say. Right? That would be begging the question. The idea is giving you reasons to doubt that somebody's given testimony that a miracle has just happened. And essentially, it just runs like this. Most of the time, when people say that a miracle has happened, they're either wrong or lying most of the time, right? There's all these examples of miracles from different religions and whatever, but claims by children about miracles, and I don't know, claims by people trying to take your money from on the TV. Who
heaven is for real.
Yeah, right. That most of the time, unless you think that that's wrong, so thinking that that's wrong means that most of the time they're right. That all these people, they're all in contradictory claims of miracles, that they're all right, most, or at least at most of the time. Right? But nobody really thinks that, right? Most people think that most of the time those claims are wrong. Even if you think miracles happen sometimes, you think that they hardly ever happen, and that most testimonies towards miracles are wrong, or, well, that they're wrong for whatever reason. What that means then is that just based on the frequency, it's very unlikely that the next one you come across is going to be one of those very few genuine testimony claims. It's much more likely that it's going to be one of the ones that's not genuine, and just based on the numbers. I don't know if sometimes planes crash, right? Sometimes they do, right? But it's like 1 in a million, probably less than that. So when you get on the plane, you should expect that it won't crash. You might be nervous that it'll crash, but you don't actually think this is going to crash, or else you wouldn't get on in the first place. And I presume both of you have got on planes before. Or if you buy a lottery ticket, you might hope that it'll win. You might be a bit excited when the numbers are getting drawn, but you know the odds are very low, and you don't actually expect that you expect that it won't win because it's like 13 million to 1 or something, right? The frequency of winning tickets is much smaller than the frequency of losing tickets. So in these types of situations, the rational response, when you know the odds are like this way round, the rational response is to be doubtful about it. You should initially be doubtful that a miracle testimony is true. You should think that the miracle testimony is not true. That's Hume's argument, basically.
Right. Would it be fair to simplify it and say it's more likely or plausible that, for example, let's take Paul's in 1 Corinthians 15 example where he appeals to 500 people, to say it's more likely that 500 men died than God intervening, if God exists, intervening and exceeding that capacity of the laws of nature, right? Or it's more likely that men lied than that a miracle occurred. Similar to how we would say that with regards to like aliens, right? It's more likely that say someone says they got abducted last night. It's more likely that they're lying than that it actually happened.
Well,
is that more along the lines, or is that still kind of missing the point?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's more likely that they're wrong, right? It doesn't mean that they're lying. I mean, people can genuinely believe something, right?
Right.
All those, I don't know, Hindu miracle claims or whatever, they're not all made by people who are lying, but presumably we think that they're all wrong, one way or the other. They just got it wrong, right? They're not lying. or people who, David Blaine goes and does a card trick or something, they come away thinking that that genuinely happened. They're not lying. I mean, I assume maybe they're just stooges, right? But assuming that he is actually fooling those people, they are being genuine when they say, oh, I saw a miracle, or I saw him do magic or something. They're wrong, right? Because there's a way it actually isn't magic, but they're being honest, right? So the distinction between being honest and being correct, right? You can be honest but be wrong.
So say like was like a preceptor, when people used to bring up the problem of miracles, I used to say, oh, that's just your presuppositions. You presuppose that God doesn't exist, therefore this can't happen. But I presuppose it does exist, therefore it can. But that's not really helpful, right? Since even certain theists would still say that it's more plausible that, for example, I'm a Christian, it's more plausible that the miracles in Hindu religion didn't happen. So could still apply to a theist, correct?
Yeah, right. So what you should be thinking about is the probability that a piece of testimony is correct, right? Not the probability that the miracle happened, right? Somebody tells you, oh, last night I saw this statue cry milk or something, right? What you're evaluating is whether or not the thing that they just said is true, whether the sentence they said was true, right? It's more likely that that person got it wrong in some way, even if miracles do happen, right? It's just people often get things wrong, right? They often wishfully think, oh, I was just praying for my little brother who's ill to get better, and then I saw this like face of the Mother Mary in the cloud or something. It was a miracle or something. It's just more likely that they were wishful thinking or got it wrong, or it just looked like the Mother Mary to them at that angle or something. It's not really a miracle.
Right. So
it's just more likely that their testimony is wrong. So it's not a question of whether
like
miracles can happen.
Right. So like if someone came up to me and they said, I saw Dylan crack a smile, it's most likely they're wrong because Dylan never smiles. But yeah, go on, Alex.
Well, yeah, okay. So the idea there is that then if that's right, and it does seem to me that that's right, what that means is simply it's not. You don't have to say miracles are impossible. You just have to say that miracles are very infrequent. So, and that means that's enough for you to say, like I say, I'm not saying planes never crash or planes can't crash. The crashing of planes is possible, and in fact sometimes happens. But because I know how infrequently it happens, I go onto the plane with a certain expectation. We call it the prior probability of that planes crash is low because it happens very infrequently. My prior probability that this lottery ticket, or my probability that this lottery ticket will win is also low because I know what the odds are. I very infrequently do lottery tickets win. Well, so if we go on to this, if we have, and that's right, that's rational. It seems to me that that's completely unassailably rational. Even if you think that God exists and does miracles, you should still think that most testimony is wrong. So in order to doubt this beginning point, you'd have to be the type of person who thinks that miracle claims are more likely true than false. And that seems to me very difficult to sustain. Like only the most wondrous child thinks that every miracle claim is true, right? Or that most
no rational theist would affirm that either. I hope no Christian would affirm that.
Yeah, well, I mean, so maybe there are people who do, but this argument isn't for them, right? It's for everybody else. So once you start taking this type of perspective, then you need very strong persuasion to change your mind about any given piece of testimony. So say my dad comes along, I trust my dad, he's normally reliable or whatever, but still, I'm not sure that I would believe him if he just said, oh, hey, I just saw this dude walking across the water or something. I'd be like, somebody's tricked you. Did he ask you for money? Has he got your credit card number? Blah, blah, blah. I'd be worried about him. I wouldn't just go, oh, really, that happened then? Brilliant. Even though it was my dad, right? I'd be wondering about his failing mental capacities or something like that. I wouldn't even believe my dad's testimony. He has a perfect track record, as far as I know, of not willfully misleading me on important matters. So, you know, even then, I think that it's reasonable for me to not believe him, given the frequency. It's the same with, like, you know, if somebody told me, oh, I won the lottery, I might be a bit dubious until they actually start, you know, doing something about it, buying fast cars or something. Then I definitely believe them. And there's another element to this, which is like the risk that's involved or something. Like, if it doesn't really make any difference to me, let's say you go, oh, I've got a friend once who won the lottery. I know that people winning the lottery is very infrequent. It's very unlikely that you'd have a friend who won the lottery. On the other hand, it doesn't really matter to me, and I can just go, well, I mean, I guess you did, but, you know, I, in a very lukewarm way, assent to it for the time being. I'm not going to bet my house on it being true, because I still think it's quite possible that you've been misled in some way. I'd start betting my house on it being true once I've seen the guy's bank balance, and I've, you know, while I might believe you about an unlikely thing that happened, I'm only going to be confident in your testimony of an unlikely thing happening when it's been supported by some other kind of evidence. That seems to me rational as well. And then it seems to me, when we come to look at these reports of miracles in the Bible, I don't find them to be nearly convincing enough to push me over the kind of credulity threshold that I would need to get to in order to start taking these things on board. It seems much more likely, though I couldn't tell you exactly how, that somebody got mixed up somewhere along the lines, somebody's being cynical somewhere along the lines. I don't know how these things have happened, but they've been handed down to us over thousands of years, and so many people's vested interests, so many people's opportunities to get things wrong, that I just don't, I'm not persuaded, you know. and especially because the risk is very high for me. You're asking me to, like, change my worldview or whatever and believe in stuff that I otherwise don't believe in. It's not like you just saying, oh, I knew someone once who won the lottery. I don't have to change my life now because I accept that proposition. I can give it lukewarm assent without doing anything, so I'm more likely to do so. But with the claims of the divinely risen Jesus, seems like if I'm going to accept that, I have to start changing my life or whatever. So there's a risk involved, right? I don't want to change my life if I'm wrong. So I'm not going to accept it without the strong evidence. And I don't see that strong evidence. Maybe you can, that's where I'm coming from with this. Right? It seems like,
right.
So as William Lane Craig and others who argue for the argument, they wouldn't say that the evidence for the resurrection is that the Bible says God rose Jesus from the dead or whatever. They would say there's these certain facts that most historians agree on, like the tomb was found empty and the disciples believed that Jesus had risen from the dead. Here's an explanatory hypothesis to explain these apparent facts, and that's that God rose Jesus from the dead.
Well, so let's take the example of the tomb being empty. It might be the case that historians believe that, but what's their evidence for believing that? It's that it says so in the Bible.
Yeah,
right?
It would be that there's several books in the Bible written by independent authors, and all of them say that the tomb was found empty.
Well, they're not independent from one another, as far as I understand it. Mark is written first, right? And Matthew and Luke use Mark as a source. So they're not independent from one another. And regardless, they're not written by, they're written, what, Mark is written, what, 30 years or more after?
Yeah, sometimes it's dated to 70, 80 or later.
Right, so 40 years after. So a book was written by somebody, I don't know who that was, and it's not even purporting to be an eyewitness. And then another two books were written which quote the first one, and that means that they're not independent in the sense that, well, they're not complete. Independence isn't all or nothing, but they clearly knew of Mark, and that means that they're not completely independent from Mark. And then what's the last one? John is completely different again, but his was written the latest, and it's the one that's the most embellished. So I feel that there's less reason to believe what happens in John than in. I mean, how do you explain? Don't you think that the development of the synoptics in terms of them having ever greater miracles and more flashy examples of stuff means that it seems like they're and that they're dated later? It doesn't seem like it's an exaggeration that's happening, right?
Well, it could be, because the authors at least wanted to include more that would make it more obvious or something that Jesus is divine. And then going outside of the Bible, the other Gospels that were never included, they start having a lot more exaggerated stories, like a walking cross or whatever.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's one of the reasons historians think Mark was written earliest, is because it has the least embellished stories in there, and as well as the shortest and most simple. So I think what they would say in terms of independence, though, is that the empty tomb narratives in Matthew and Luke don't resemble that of Mark. So they may have been aware of what Mark says, but they had their own independent tradition in terms of it.
Yeah, well, but now we're talking about similarity as opposed to independence, and not being similar to each other actually does more harm than good. Whereas you want them to be maximally independent, but you don't want them to be maximally different, right? And so if they say different things about what happened in the empty tomb story or the resurrection story, that makes you wonder which one of them is right. Because if they say different things, then they're not all right. You see what I mean? Like,
yeah, I get what you're saying, but wouldn't that be only in terms of if they're contradicting each other? So the idea would be they tell the same story, but in different ways.
I don't think that anything can be construed as an outright contradiction in those stories that I know of. But I do think that there are things which make it difficult to accept that some of those things happen. And is it in Luke where there's a bunch of saints or something that get
in Matthew, the saints are resurrected, and then the veil is torn in the temple.
So to me, the idea of those saints being resurrected and not featuring in any historical document of the time, because you would have thought that some event like that would be noticeable, makes me feel like it's a genre other than straightforward reporting of facts. Something's going on there, but it doesn't seem to me that it's just somebody saying something that can be relied on as something that definitely happened. There's a message that's trying to be sent, and there's some context which may easily have been lost. Like if in 2,000 years' time, the only few scattered remarks about what's going on in, the UK election was like one or two snippets of radio commentary and a couple of adverts or something, people would have such a weird, impossible time trying to figure out the straightforward description of facts about what's happening. They wouldn't understand the in-jokes and the references and the imagery and the blah, blah, blah. And I don't know what that story is supposed to mean, but it does seems to me that it's not. I mean, do you think that do you think those to be a straightforward description, and do you think if it is that it's also true? I mean,
right. I know that some people think it's probably some type of apocalyptic symbolism, I think. Personally, I I don't really take a position. I haven't even properly studied that text, but I have heard different theories with regards to it. I think William and Craig even says that it could be possible that it's just some type of apocalyptic symbolism.
Yeah, well, I mean, it seems to me that once you start going down that route, then I don't really get why you stop at any particular point. I mean, Mark could easily be entirely symbolic to me, because it's such a strange picture of Jesus as a guy who kind of fails to heal people, and sometimes the apostles don't know what he's talking about, and he dies says, "Why have you forsaken me?" And then the women come and find the empty tomb and just run off, and they never tell anyone. Right? And then you've got that story that's tacked on at the end, which everyone agrees wasn't in the original. That's how it's supposed to end. Now, it sounds to me like what that story is a kind of that like it's a juxtaposed with the traditional messianic idea of the kind of conquering David style guy who's going to come back and reestablish Judea or whatever. Something like how Muhammad was this conquering hero who won new lands and blah blah blah, right? That's what the Jews are expecting Jesus to be like. And then the temple gets sacked by Titus or Domitian or whoever it is, and the Jewish diaspora happens. And it's around that time that Mark is written. And I mean, I don't think it's fair to just go, oh, this is just stuff that definitely happened, right? It seems to me like, I mean, I'm just making this up, of course, but like I could see it being some kind of story about, like someone saying, well, what if the Messiah came and like, no one noticed and like we killed him by accident, and that was it, and it's already happened. And what if that was, I don't know whether that's what they were trying to say or really what the purpose of that message would be, but I find that that's at least possible, and it could just be that it's all a big misunderstanding, and then that's one narrative that someone was putting out that was telling a certain type of story for a certain political effect or some kind of in-house, in-community referenced symbolism that we don't understand. And then the other gospels are different people playing with the same idea for different reasons and different political contexts, say, giving different messages that they understood that we don't understand, saying different things about it. Or maybe they're getting it wrong and they don't understand the subtle message of Mark, and they're just trying to win people over to their power group or something by trying to convince them. I don't know that any of those things are true, of course, right? But I don't think that you don't know that they're true, or that anyone doesn't know that they're true. And so it's like someone saying, oh, well, 90% of historians agree that blah, blah, blah. Something really fishy about that. I mean, everyone agrees, say, that the Holocaust happened or that Trump won the election last year. Those are historical facts, technically. But the reason that the reason that we believe those things is because they're so recent that there's like tangible evidence left that you can go and look at and see. Now, there's no tangible evidence of any of the stories that happened in the Gospels at all. None of those. I mean, you can see that Palestine was a place or something. I mean, I guess in that sense, it's not entirely fictional, but you don't know that in any given story in the Bible that any of that happened. And you couldn't do because there couldn't be any evidence of Jesus having turned water into wine left anymore, right? There is evidence of like a gas chamber or something that's still around, and there is evidence of Trump still around, obviously, because that's still going on. But when someone says, oh, all the historians agree on that, they're already saying something about ancient history, which is different to contemporary history. In ancient history, you can be kind of sure about big, broad sweeps of things. Like, you can say, well, Alexander the Great kind of charged through the Middle East and conquered Persia and got as far as India and stuff. Because, there's like lots of evidence that he did stuff broadly like that. But when you focus in on like individual battles, it's not quite clear that this battle happened exactly here or on this day. The speeches that are ascribed to him by the historians probably just made those up, right? To give a good story, it roughly accounts for what sort of thing they might have said, blah, blah, blah. But ancient historians may agree that Alexander the Great existed, but they don't agree that he said those exact specific things. And I find it very strange that there's an area of ancient history where everyone somehow agrees that very specific time and date, place, events happened, or we all agree that this person on this date and this place did this thing. I can't see any other area of ancient history where anyone agrees with any of those types of things. And it might be that they've got 4 books that, in some sense, describe those things happening, but I just can't get my head around.
I think I know.
Can persuade.
I think I know what you're trying to get at. So would it be helpful if I said that there's a difference between historical facts of, for example, let's say the Vietnam War, right? We have pictures of it. You know, some of it was even live broadcasted. There's proof in radio edits, television broadcasts. It's different to say this is a historical fact versus which we would base on this specific type of evidence, newspaper pictures, versus saying something else is a historical fact based on ancient history, which bases it on different types of evidence, which is manuscripts and things that are
Mm.
a bit less certain than looking at a picture and listening to a television
Yeah.
broadcast. So there should be that distinction, I think, is what you're trying to say, between what we declare a historical fact. The distinction should be based on what evidence we are using to say that X is a fact. Is that kind of along the lines of what you're trying to get at?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that even if 90% of ancient historians agree that, I don't know, Caesar crossed the Rubicon, or that Jesus's tomb was found empty. I mean, I can't imagine how those two things can be placed one by one. Even if it's true, though, that they all agree on that, I don't think that it's true that they're all in agree. Well, I mean, maybe the ones who have already committed their life to living as a Christian would have full confidence in it. But the ones who are just trying to evaluate those two things, I mean, say you take some Caesar specialist historian, and he thinks that Caesar crossed the Rubicon. I mean, there seems to be a pretty good reason for thinking that he did. I mean, like, it's at the top of Italy. He marches on Rome with an army. You kind of have to cross the Rubicon to get there. Most people think that those stories are broadly correct, right? He fights with Pompey in Greece, and he got there by. Anyway, whatever, there's this big narrative that goes on, right? If you believe any of that kind of narrative, he kind of has to cross the Rubicon. He probably didn't say the die is cast as he did it, which is what's reported to. He reports on himself saying he probably didn't, right? It just sounds cool. And he probably thought afterwards, I wish I'd said the die had been cast. I know I'll write that in my memoir so everyone thinks that I did, right? I mean, so the Caesar specialist probably shrug his shoulders and say, I don't know whether he said that, right? I'm pretty sure that he crossed the Rubicon. But if, he's not going to stake his life on it. Because maybe Caesar jumped in a boat and went around the coast instead whilst his army crossed. Right? He's not going to stake his life on that. He's still going to think that it happened, but he can't really know that it happened because there's no film of him doing it. And
right.
So, 100% of Caesar historians will say that Caesar crossed the Rubicon because there's no evidence that he didn't, and there's evidence he did, but they won't stake their life on it.
Couldn't we make a point then that, with respect to the evidence we have, this seems like it's the case? Like, we could say, well, with respect to this evidence, it seems like Jesus's tomb was found empty, but because of how limited our evidence is, we can't really say it is probably true that Jesus's tomb was found empty.
Yeah. It's with respect to the evidence that we've got, that's true. I mean, because that's what it says in those accounts. But there's no reason to think that those accounts are reliable. I think there's good reason to think that they're not reliable. For instance, I don't think that those other accounts of miracles are even slightly plausible. I mean, the sun is supposed to have been obstructed as well, right? But no other astronomers note that happened in China or India or wherever, when they would have done, because they do note those types of things in those cultures at that time. So no one else notices that. Seems unlikely that that's a true report of something that happened. Same with the resurrection of the saints. So I start to think that these other stories of the miracles, which aren't in Mark, but are in the later Gospels, turning the water into wine and stuff, they're probably just embellishments that didn't happen either. And once you've got a story where you're more confident than not that it's got embellishments that aren't true, it starts to taint the whole thing, right? Like, if I say to you, well, my friend came round last night and we played poker for a bit and then he went home, you're probably going to say, okay, fine, fair enough. But then if I say, oh, my friend came round last night and he turned water into wine and we played poker for a bit and then he went home, you're probably going to think, did any of that happen? Like, I mean, were you dreaming? Are you sane? I mean, so you're saying that someone came around and like, the incredibility of one aspect of the story taints the rest of it. So if I think it's already got a load of stuff in there that's obviously not true, and it's not because I'm saying, but I know metaphysically that miracles can't happen. Maybe they do. Right? I'm already skeptical that they do, but I'm very skeptical that there's specific miracles that should have led to other observations and didn't. I think those didn't happen because of that. So why would I think that, just one extra miracle that just happens to be definitely true and is in fact just a report of something that happened, when I don't think that, the saints were resurrected. I don't think that the sun was obstructed. I mean, so I think that the dodgy nature of the rest of the miracle reports taints the reliability of the rest of the testimony. And I'm already skeptical of testimony in general, of strange events and unlikely events. So, I mean, my credibility rate, my credence in the reliability of those stories is really, really low. And I'm kind of, Gary Habermas told me, 90% of people believe, 90% of New Testament historians believe this. Like, as I said before, if you exclude those ones who are already religiously committed to the veracity of the text and look at those ones who aren't, even then, if they say that that's what happened, I want to know how much they think that it happened, or whether it's just they say on the basis of the text, I think that that's what happened. Because if it's the latter, I would agree, and I'd also say that, on the basis of the text of Lord of the Rings, Frodo goes to Mordor or something. It doesn't mean I think Frodo went to Mordor at all. I think that's what, on the basis of the text, that's what it says in the text. Right? If that's what it means, if that's what Habermas is saying, 90% of people agree on, that's not evidence in any way, that they think that thing happened. Right? They think that that's what the text says.
Yeah, I was going to make that distinction too. I think it's fair to say that history can deem historical, but that doesn't mean that the entire content found in a historical document is necessarily factual, correct?
Mm.
And but yeah, so I think we can that history can say something is a historical fact, but that there's different epistemic levels with regards to specific evidence, correct? So we can say that, for example, like the example I use about the Vietnam War, we can be more sure of that from a let's say I'm not let's say that I'm speaking to just well, I am speaking to someone who's not a Christian. So you wouldn't have that uh that you're not leaning towards the truth of scripture. So you would say that when you look at these claims about miracles, about the resurrection, it's the same as if, let's say, someone showed you a video of a friend turning water into wine. You think there's some trick going on behind that. So even if you had this higher level of evidence, which is a video, you would still question it due to the fact that it just seems very unlikely that someone could really turn it, and it seems more likely that it's just some type of trick.
Well, so you can see people turning water into wine, right? Because there are magicians who will do that. But you can also see, there are actually people who will give you testimony of alien technology, alien experiences, that they've seen all this stuff happen. I talked to someone once who told me that he had seen an alien spaceship once. Now, and if you go on, there's this thing called the Disclosure Project. You can Google that. There's a 9-hour bloody press conference with a bunch of people who all claim to be military and police and blah blah blah, who are giving testimony or whatever. And it was a big thing. It happened in 2001. Now, I don't think that that's true, right? I'm not convinced that it's true, right? I think that they're probably all either wrong or lying, or it's some kind of prank or something, right? I'm not just going to go, oh, well, in that case, now I believe that the government is conspiring against me and NASA is faking moon landings and stuff like that. I'm not going down that rabbit hole, even though I've seen video testimony of dozens of people all claiming to have firsthand experience with extraterrestrials or whatever. Now, that's much better evidence than the Bible. It's on any level. It's not 40 years afterwards. It's not written down. It's not that we don't know who they are. They're real. They're all alive now. Those people who gave that testimony, presumably some of them may have died, but they're pretty much all alive now. You YouTube it, go and find them. You guys live in North America. You could go and interview those people if you wanted to. So if why don't you believe? You should just believe them. You should believe that aliens exist and have visited the Earth, and that people have, and the government knows about it. I mean, if you watch that video, if you're consistent with, you should believe that more than the Bible, because it's better evidence than the Bible. But I think rationally you shouldn't believe either of them. But it seems to me that on your own criteria, you should believe them more than your own religious claims, which, at least based on, if ignoring any other, maybe you think your own personal first-hand testimony is more, might be fair enough, but let's just talk about the belief that you have really based on the historical documents, right? That it seems to me that there's better contemporary documents for extraordinary claims that you should embrace willingly. And I think that is a kind of reductio ad absurdum of the idea that the historical evidence for Christianity is strong, because I think it means that you would embrace a whole bunch of other stuff that would lead you to, and for one thing, it might lead you to things that clash with Christianity too. So the good thing about being skeptical and not believing lots of different things, keeping your skepticism gate quite difficult to get through, is it means you're less likely to be persuaded to believe two things that contradict one another. Whereas if you're quite credulous, then you're more likely to believe two incompatible things. And it seems to me that
and I'd say and I'd say that at least most Christians that I know, and at least how the Bible states how conversion and belief in God works, I'd say that, you know, they don't really base their belief in it based on like the resurrection, right? Or I think it'd be very, very, very weak to base it on that. You know, a lot of times it's just something similar to like why I believe, right? I feel that I have peace with God now that Jesus Christ died for my sins and that I've been reconciled to the Father. And this type of personal experience, I guess it kind of gets into the Alvin Plantinga properly basic beliefs, and how God can be a properly basic belief. But I'd agree that to base your belief in God or the Judeo-Christian God, like the historical evidence for the resurrection or for the empty tomb and so forth, is even in some case a type of believing contradictory. Believe this testimony, then why not believe the testimony of the Hindus and their miracles? Or if you're a Protestant who believes in, you know, in God because of this type of evidence, why don't you believe in Catholicism because they have other miracles as well, and why not believe their testimonies? A friend of mine was speaking to a Muslim lady, and she prophesied to him, and like it was like pretty accurate. She's like, "You're going through this, and this right now," you know. And so I mean, if you're basing your beliefs on strictly testimonies as well, right? So I do sympathize in a sense with a lot of what you're saying, and I think this should, if they are basing their beliefs strictly on evidences and so forth, I think there is a type of irrationality to that, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's I don't know. It's not. I mean, I don't believe in any of these religious claims, but I also don't think that I know how the world works. I don't have a strictly mechanistic picture, and it's not just because I've made my mind up. It's not because I'm mad at God for not making me rich and famous or something. There's no. I mean, like, I just feel like I don't think that somebody would persuade me by merely presenting me with an argument I couldn't think of an objection to. Right, I think it would take a lot of things to turn me round. Right, so I'm not on the cusp of believing. Right, I'm quite firmly on the other side. However, I do think that it could happen. Right? I mean, there's a big sense of mystery in existence. Right, why is any of this happening at all? Right, why is this conversation happening? Why do I have experience of anything at all? And
why are we friends?
What? Sorry.
Why are we friends?
Yeah, well, but you know, why anything? I don't know that, and it seems like that's such a big and profound mystery that it's kind of an act of hubris to assume that you know enough to shut your mind off to any possibility, right? I mean, it might be that Christianity is true, right? It might be. It would be weird, but then, you know, it's already mind-bogglingly weird that anything happens. So it's stupid to say that you should be closed-minded to something. But on the other hand, whilst you keep the door open to everything, you also keep it quite firmly close to being closed for lots of things. And not doing that is irrational, it seems to me, like that. And that's what we were just going through. I'm trying to make my mind up on the basis of things where, the same reasoning that means that I don't think, the same reasoning that makes me think that flying in a plane is safe, it seems to me, is the same type of reasoning that makes me think that reports of miracles are probably not true, or any given report of a miracle probably isn't true. It seems to me it's the same reasoning in each case. Anyway, we've been going on a very long time, so I think
yes, we have
this to an end, because I don't feel like we're going to say
yeah, I definitely have to. I have to get going as well. But I'd encourage you to, like, probably, have you read through like the book of Romans in the Bible before?
No, don't think so. I mean, I certainly haven't read the whole
I think right. That'd be a good definitely a good book to read. I'm not trying to promote mysticism or anything either, or shove something down your throat, but I think that, that's a book that that I hold very near and dear to my heart, and I just like to recommend it. And I consider you a good friend, though we've not spoken too much, but I admire your intellect, and you're very nice and kind, and you're not a militant atheist like Richard Dawkins or other folk.
No.
Extend my sincere gratitude for coming on to the show, and it really does mean a lot.
No, thanks. Thanks for having me on. It's been an interesting conversation.
Dylan, is there anything you'd like to say?
Yeah, just thanks for coming on the show, Alex, and hope to do it again sometime.
We'll come up with some more arguments, and then I'll come on, tell you what I think.
All right, sounds good.
Awesome. All right, I'll come up with a few. Alex, you want to let people know about your podcast and your blog one more time so they could check it out?
Yeah, so maybe you can put a link into the episode. And my podcast is called Thoughtology. So it's like the word tautology, but with the word thought at the beginning. Thoughtology. And yeah, I'm going to be talking to a philosopher called Wes Morriston on Tuesday about the kalam, cosmological argument. So that should be quite fun.
That's going to be pretty cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Listen to it a few times, because there's some things that you might have to press stop or rewind and listen to again. And it was definitely a treat. God bless, and thank you for tuning in.